Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 6, 2026. What happens to various groups after the FAIRtax is enacted? In his 1934 book, I, Candidate for Governor, and How I Got Licked, Upton Sinclair famously wrote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." The FAIRtax repeals federal, individual, and corporate income taxes, payroll taxes, and estate and gift taxes. It replaces all that with a single, broad-based national retail sales tax administered by the states. The FAIRtax abolishes the Internal Revenue Service, and it eliminates the need to file both individual and corporate income tax returns. The FAIRtax establishes a 23% tax-inclusive federal sales tax on the purchase of new retail goods and services. Now let's look at some of the fundamental structural differences between the income tax and the FAIRtax. Under the current income tax system, the primary tax base is income, profits, and payrolls. For the FAIRtax, it'll be retail consumption of new goods and services. The inclusive tax rate in the federal income tax is progressive, varying from 10 to 37%. For the FAIRtax, it's a flat 23%, but that is adjustable annually. Exclusive tax rate is not applicable to the income tax. It's 30% for the FAIRtax. Looking at the enforcement agency, the current federal income tax is enforced by the Internal Revenue Service. For the FAIRtax, it will be the state sales tax authorities and treasury bureaus. When do you incur your tax liability? Under the income tax, you are liable for taxes at the time you earn money or you realize a profit from the sale of capital assets. For the FAIRtax, your liability comes at the time of final retail purchase of new goods and services. Savings and investment, that's taxed under the income tax. Capital gains, dividends, and interest are all taxable. Under the FAIRtax, savings and investment totally tax-free. Only spending is taxed. And for the income tax, basic needs relief is provided by deductions, exemptions, and credits. For the FAIRtax, it's got a monthly family consumption allowance, which exempts purchases up to the poverty level for each legal family. Businesses would no longer pay federal taxes on their net income, dividends, or payrolls under the FAIRtax. This creates a massive incentive to repatriate offshore earnings, which are currently parked abroad, to avoid the U.S. corporate income tax. Let's look at how the FAIRtax will impact different business groups, what their response is likely to be. Retailers, they will have a collection burden, but they'll be paid a 0.25% fee for their time and effort. Their strategic response will be to likely upgrade point-of-sale systems and audit sales reporting. Business-to-business service providers, those sales are not taxable, and they are likely to expand services, focus on business investment. Under the FAIRtax, manufacturers will pay no tax on their inputs or exports, and the strategic response is likely going to be to repatriate operations to the United States and lower export prices. And finally, for small businesses, the FAIRtax will remove the cost and difficulty of payroll tax compliance, and they are likely to increase hiring and simplify bookkeeping. Now, small businesses would deal with the change by repurposing the administrative time currently spent on payroll withholdings and income tax filings and move that towards operational growth. There's a 0.25% administrative fee provided to retail businesses for collecting and forwarding the FAIRtax. Now, some of the people who profit from the present income payroll tax system, let's look at that. The complexity and complications of the income payroll tax system have created an entire industry of good-paying jobs that will be unnecessary when the FAIRtax is passed. Now, these groups are solidly united in opposing any real tax reform to the income payroll tax system. Now, many of them actually do realize that the FAIRtax would be better for the country, but they still oppose it because it represents a financial threat to them and their families. With 150 million individual tax returns eliminated, tax professionals will have to deal with the change through a massive structural pivot towards client advisory services. These client advisory services will include the expansion of outsourced CFO roles. Small businesses will still need sophisticated financial analysis even if they no longer file income taxes. CPAs will have to transition into business advisors, focusing on cash flow, revenue forecasting, and risk management, actually helping their clients' businesses do better. Audit and compliance oversight. Retailers would need internal controls to ensure their sales tax collections are accurate and to avoid state penalties. Accounting firms would shift their audit departments to focus on these high-volume transactional reviews. Let's look at legal professionals who specialize in tax planning. To survive, these individuals will need to either become advisors on how to protect assets and handle liabilities, or switch to other areas of the law, business work, or other specialties. And finally, there's wealth management and estate planning. While the estate tax might be gone, the merit-based management of multi-generational wealth would still require expert guidance. Now, the underground economy, people working for cash under the table or making their money by less than legal means, is largely untouched by the federal income tax system. Now, those people don't file income tax returns, but they do buy things. The FAIRtax will capture the underground economy, estimated at $1 trillion in lost revenue annually. Currently, participants in illicit trades such as drug trafficking, unrecorded labor, or just working for cash or taking payments partially in cash, these folks can easily avoid income and payroll taxes. But under the FAIRtax, these individuals would pay their federal tax burden at the point of consumption when they buy a car or a meal or a new TV. Similarly, undocumented immigrants will pay the full 30% sales tax without being eligible for the prebate, which requires a valid Social Security number. This makes this demographic net taxpayers in every transaction, effectively broadening the tax base to include every resident and visitor within U.S. borders. Now, many wealthy Americans don't sell assets to fund their consumption. They use very low-interest loans. Now, under the FAIRtax, the very wealthy will pay the FAIRtax when they purchase their yachts and mansions. Now, many retailers are concerned that the FAIRtax will dramatically affect their business if imports that have largely escaped any federal taxation are now subject to the FAIRtax. It's a border-adjusted tax system. Exports are now non-taxable, while imports are subject to the same 30% sales tax as domestic products. For U.S. exporters, the impact on border adjustment will be a 10 to 20% lower cost due to removed hidden taxes. That means they are likely to expand international market share. For foreign manufacturers, they'll face a 30% tax at the U.S. retail level, meaning they will likely build manufacturing plants inside the United States. International tourists, they'll also pay the 30% tax on all U.S. purchases, which means tourism becomes a major federal revenue stream. And finally, U.S. consumers. Imports become 30% more expensive, so U.S. consumers are likely to focus on domestically produced goods. In conclusion, the elimination of the federal income payroll tax system with the FAIRtax represents the most significant socioeconomic restructuring in modern American history. By taxing the outflow of money rather than the inflow, the FAIRtax ensures that the more an individual in the U.S. spends on new retail goods and services, the more they contribute to the nation's revenue. We should ask any who oppose the FAIRtax because it displaces workers, well, isn't it true that these displaced workers can start providing services that don't just push paper around, but actually contribute to the productivity, profitability, and success of our businesses? The FAIRtax is the answer. The FAIRtax is a national retail sales tax on new retail goods and retail services. It provides a family credit so that all purchases up to the poverty level for each legal family are not taxed. There's no withholding from your paycheck, and you never have to file an income tax return again telling the government how much you earned and how much you spent, and you will never ever be harassed by the Internal Revenue Service again because the FAIRtax abolishes the IRS. Now, many of you have labored tirelessly for freedom from the federal income tax and the IRS. You deserve a great deal of credit for your efforts to educate the American people on the need to fund the American government in a way that's good for America and returns freedom to the American people. It's imperative, though, that we don't replace the current income tax and the IRS with an alternative system that can still be manipulated by the ruling elite. We must let Congress and the President know that the best way to replace the income tax and the IRS is with the FAIRtax. Now, make no mistake about it. The FAIRtax is a grave threat to the ruling elite. It will strip them of their power and their ability to control us through the tax system. Their opposition to the fair tax will be fierce and unrelenting. And don't think for an instant they won't use half-truths, deception, and downright lies in their desperate attempts to hang on to their power. However, with the support of this president, we can finally eliminate the income tax and the IRS. Of course, the best course of action is not only to repeal the income tax and abolish the IRS, but to repeal the 16th Amendment as well, so no future administration can ever shackle the American people with an income tax again. We must come together and ensure that real tax reform, the fair tax, is not subverted by the elites in D.C. This will take the diligent effort from all of us. We need your financial assistance and we need your grassroots assistance. Now, if you have contacts that will allow us to get more information about the fair tax to President Trump, please let us know. Please email us at info@fairtax.org and we'll give you some options on how you can best help us. At a minimum, please call your congressional representative and ask if he or she supports the fair tax. If so, thank him or her for their support and suggest they become a co-sponsor of H.R. 25 if they're not one already. If not, ask why not. Now, if your representative claims to be unfamiliar with the fair tax, offer to have someone come to their office and explain it to them. The solution? Pass the fair tax. Now, why would D.C. pass the fair tax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to FAIRtax.org to invest in AFFT and help us pass the fair tax. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.